Track is a monthly web TV show about cryptozoology, natural history, green issues, and whatever else the team feel like making up as they go along. Enjoy.
So, what's on today's show, Mr. John?
Well, in this episode, Richard Freeman and I go through our favourite cryptozoological and Fortean books. Check this out, you funk soul brother.
I really like the old credits.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Downs. I'm the director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and I'm just about to introduce you to another episode of On the Track. However, for that, more importantly, it's Tales from the North with Barry Tadcaster and Amos Uttersweat.
So, Amos Uttersweat, what are we going to be looking at in today's episode? Well, Barry, we're going to be looking at how to make a southern cocktail. And how do you make a southern cocktail, Amos? You use shandy, mix it with baby sham, and put a bleeding pink umbrella in it. And what would a northern cocktail be? Ale and a pie.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got two old friends come to visit us in the studio today. It's Cara and it's Ralph the Monster. What are you here to do today, Cara and Ralph the Monster?
So Ralph, what's coming up? Book review.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we saw from the introduction, this is book reviews, but it's not your normal book reviews. Because Richard and I are going to do something I don't think we've ever done before. We're going to go through our favourite books in the crypto and Fortean genre. This is almost taken at random because I'm sure if you asked either of us next week, we'd probably have at least some different ones in our list. For example, at the moment, my favourite cryptozoological book at the moment is Adrian Shine's book on the natural history of sea serpents. But I've not put this in my top 5 because it only came out a matter of months ago and I'm still assimilating it into my mental library. But here we go with Richard's and my top 10s. We start off with the one of Richard. Richard, Into the Uncanny. This is something I've never heard of.
Yes, it's a relatively new book. It is a book based on the series that was in turn based on the podcast called The Uncanny, fronted by Danny Robbins with parapsychologist Evelyn Hallow and skeptic Kieran O'Keefe. And it is a wonderful podcast, a wonderful series, and a wonderful book because they don't fall into the most haunted type absolute nonsense, believing every little sound is the soul of an undead human being or a spirit from beyond, and they're not knee-jerk skeptics either. And it balances that better than any other podcast I've ever seen or listened to. The series was equally as good, and the book was fantastic because the book it tackled cases that were not in the podcast or in the TV series, so it's all totally new material. And there are some really compelling cases. There's one about a village, the name of which now completely escapes me. But it started with a man who wanted to get rid of an old-fashioned pram. These old-fashioned big prams, and the bin men won't take it. So he decides the best thing to do is bury it in the garden. And he digs this whacking great hole in the garden. And suddenly his spade hits something, and he's found like a pathway or a road paved, obviously very old. And that seems to trigger something. And then the whole thing seems to turn into a story by Nigel Neal, because throughout the village they see spectres of people from the English Civil War, invisible phantom horses that seem to thunder through houses in great herds, and a sort of death-like looming hooded figure. And dozens of people all through this village experience this, and it's really weird. That's just one case. There's another case where a guy, he's about 18, I think 17, 18, and he'd been working at a pub as a barman, and he has to catch the last bus back, and the bus drops him at the top of the lane where his house is, and it's winter and it's snowing, and this is up in Yorkshire if I remember correctly. And he's walking home, and he gets to his house, and there by the fence there's this great round leathery ball, and he says it couldn't have been there that long because the snow hadn't accumulated on it, and something told him not to go near it. It was dangerous, whatever it was, this instinct. And then the ball sort of unfurls like some sort of Chinese puzzle and figures itself into this leathery entity with these long, spiny, slender limbs with pointed ends that look predatory. And it stalks off round the side of the house, and you can see its tracks going around the house. And Janet Walke from Lapis had a similar experience when she was walking a dog in a park near Blackpool. She saw this big round leathery ball, almost like a medicine ball, and her dog was growling at it, and she thought that wasn't there before. What the hell is it? And another man walks up, he's walking his dog, and she asks him if he can see anything weird over there. When she turns around again, it's gone, which sounds very similar. There's another case about a guy who's living he's living in, I think it's in Rome. Yeah, it's in Rome, and he gets a regular gig with one of his friends. He's only a young guy in his teens again. He gets a gig babysitting for his friend's daughters, and he goes into the kitchen and finds that all the crockery from all of the cupboards has been laid out on the floor without any of it being broken, and he sort of freaks out. And when the parents come back, they see he's upset, and she said, "Oh, you've seen what happens in the kitchen," and she tells him that this happens all the time. And this house abuts onto a building where they train young British priests that come over to become Catholic priests. And he mentions this to two young guys who are training to be priests, and they say, could you come with us because the Monsignor will want to talk to you about it. And they take him to the Monsignor, and he explains where it was, and it turns out that the kitchen is exactly abutting. There's just a wall between them. This place where they put everything to do with the Antichrist, like books and relics and stuff to do with the Antichrist. And they say they keep the room locked. There's one key to it, and they go into it, and they often find this stuff strewn around everywhere. Well, that's just 3 cases in this book and it is incredibly compelling, and it's all new material, and it's so well written. And big thumbs up to Danny Robbins, Evelyn Hallow, and Kieran O'Keefe, because they do a great job.
Wasn't Kieran O'Keefe one of the people most haunted, or am I dreaming now?
Yes, he was, and he's told my friend Jackie it was just entertaining. It's what we knew all along. It was just when it first started out, CJ Romer, our good friend CJ Romer, was involved in it. He was in the first series, and then they sacked him without telling him, mainly because they wanted to turn it into an entertainment show rather than a serious look at parapsychology.
Well, I don't think they succeeded because I personally never found it even slightly entertaining.
Neither did I. I just found it absurd and rather annoying.
And
It's done more damage to Forteana.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Okay, my book, my number 5 book, and really all of these except for the number 1 book, for either Richard's number 1 book or my number 1 book, all the others are really in arbitrary order. It could be in any. Would you agree, Rich?
Yeah, more or less.
My number 5 book is The Last Tigers of Hong Kong by John Saki. We had him on the show as a guest a couple of years ago, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a book about the last tiger records from Hong Kong. Now, as I'm sure you know, because I bang on about it quite a lot, I was brought up in Hong Kong, and I was surrounded by stories of tigers. I remember 1965 or 1966 there being a warning on the local English language radio station saying that people should not go walking in the Sai-Kung Peninsula this weekend because a tiger with cubs had been reported. And up until the mid-60s, this was something which happened nearly annually. But I had no idea how complicated the stories of Hong Kong tigers were. And although the tiger is a known species, the South China tiger, Felis tigris amoyensis, is almost, if not completely, extinct in the wild. And at the moment, the best hope of the survival of that subspecies, if indeed it is a subspecies, because under the latest doctrine it isn't, but that's another story, is a breeding project of them in Hong Kong, in South Africa. But well within living memory, and regularly up until a few years before I was born, there were tigers reported even on Hong Kong Island, and John Saki goes through these amazing stories of how the local tigers, which were known by a columnist for the South China Morning Post, a guy called Vincent something. He went under the pen name of Vincent Gerald, I think his name was. He called them Mr. Stripes, and he took great delight in telling the stories of how teenage boys, having walked their girlfriends home after a dance or whatever, are confronted by a fully grown tiger walking along, for example, Lugard Road, which is, for those of you who don't know, a circular road that goes round the whole of Victoria Peak. And the stories are absolutely magnificent. But it is the complete depth of tiger lore in what used to be a British colony that fascinates me. And that, together with Adrian Shine's book, are my two favourite cryptozoological books, not just of the last few years, but I think of this century. Now, to Richard, your number 4, Richie Poos.
My number 4 is The Dragon and the Disc by F.W. Holiday.
Oh, you remembered. That was clever. I just went to my notes. I'd forgotten. We were going to do a film of that, weren't we, Richard? As a kung fu movie.
Yes,
called
a Kung Fu Road movie.
Enter the Dragon.
But it never came to pass. Yes, Dragon and the Disc, I believe it was first published in 74. The early 70s being, particularly 73, being peak for worldwide Forteana. And F.W. Holiday originally wrote books on trout fishing, and then one day he saw the Loch Ness Monster. And it was part of a very long sighting, and on the other side of the loch was a policeman and some of his colleagues that saw this thing too, and they had this humpbacked entity, they had it in view for something like 45 minutes. And Holiday developed the idea that it was some sort of mollusk or gastropod, maybe an ancestor of the squid, and then he thought it might have been a giant descendant of Telemonstrum, which was a strange life form found in fossil deposits in Michigan from, I believe, the Devonian period, and it was only about that long, sort of spindle-shaped worm-like creature. No one's totally sure what it is. It was thought to be a relative of the lamprey at one time.
It looks a bit like a sort of developed flatworm, doesn't it?
Yes, but it's a complete non-starter. It's even less likely than the plesiosaur theory for the Loch Ness Monster. But he wrote a book about it called The Great Orm of Loch Ness. But as he continued to study the phenomenon of lake monsters, he became convinced that they weren't flesh and blood animals at all, that they were paranormal entities, and he linked them with sightings of UFOs, which he also thought were paranormal manifestations, not aliens in nuts and bolts spacecraft. And he also linked them with ancient legends of dragons, which were often connected with bodies of water, and he noted the extreme fear and horror that encounters with these things engendered. There was one in the 1950s from a pier. Mrs. Greta Finley and her son were fishing when this thing appeared, terrified them so badly that they never went fishing again. And in an interview, Greta Finley said it was such a horrific creature that she would never want to see it ever again, even from behind 6-inch steel bars. Another case involved a guy called Richard Jenkins and his wife that had moved in the 1970s, early 70s, I think 1970 itself. They moved to a house on the loch side, and they saw the creature from their house and watched it through binoculars, and both Jenkins and his wife said that they felt that the creature was obscene, and that even after it had gone, it left like this atmosphere of obscenity behind it, which is quite an unusual word to use when you're just seeing a mysterious animal. You don't hear people that have seen the Beast of Bodmin Moor call it obscene, or the Yeti obscene, but they said this thing was obscene.
No, but I have had two people who saw the Owl Man independently described as grotesque. Which again is a word you don't expect for an animal or an animal-like figure.
But he also widens his scope to other lakes, not just in Scotland, but in Ireland as well. And he talked to Georgina Carberry, who was a librarian from Clifton in Ireland, and in the 1950s she and some friends had been on a fishing trip in Loch Fada, and they saw this creature emerge from behind an island, and they said it had this long serpentine body that moved in loops and jaws like a shark, and it started moving towards them, and they were terrified. And as they piled into the car and drove away, and Georgina Carberry kept looking in the mirror because she felt that somehow it had left the loch and was pursuing them. And for years after she had nightmares, one of her friends had a mental breakdown and she would never go back to the lock again. She was that frightened of it. And that feeling of pursuit, I've heard that before. I've heard that in one of the famous Owlman witnesses. They said that it pursued them somehow from Cornwall back to their home, which was hundreds of miles away. And when we investigated the beast of Bowlam Lake, that sort of man-like shadowy entity seen around Bowlam Lake, the witness Naomi and her son said when they were driving away, they had a feeling that somehow it was pursuing them, and they were looking in the mirror to see if it was chasing them because they had this feeling of pursuit. So he concludes that the Loch Ness Monster is a literal dragon, and it's not a flesh and blood creature. It's a supernatural, it's an evil, malevolent, ancient supernatural manifestation, and other lake monsters elsewhere are the same, and that UFOs are a different aspect of this same manifestation. And he interprets small cave paintings as lake monsters and glowing balls of light and things. And it's a fascinating book. Now, that there are errors in it. I mean, he gives credence to the Cottingley fairies, which we know are a hoax, and they were pretty obviously a hoax straight away. He does get rather paranoid, and as his books go on, he gets more and more paranoid about this malevolent power. And in his third book, which was published after his fairly early death of a heart attack, The Goblin Universe, he goes full on into this, and he believes that all these entities and things and creatures are paranormal, and they're aspects of this same malevolent force. And it's a fascinating book, and it's a time capsule of Forteana in the early 70s, and that's why I love it.
I think my favourite of this book is the Goblin Universe. I think Goblin Universe is an absolute smashing book. And I do know what he means about one feeling surrounded and followed by malevolence and what Tony Shields called psychic backlash. This shit happens, kiddies. And I don't just wear this around my neck for amusement value or because I want to get up Catholic chicks. Now, my fourth book seems to go on really rather well from there, because although I didn't plan it that way, it's another partially Loch Ness book. It's Monstrum by Tony Shields. Tony Doc Shields, who died just under a year ago, was a very dear friend of mine. In fact, in many ways, he was like a father to me, because when my first wife and I divorced, my parents disowned me for a while, and Tony took over and looked after me, and he was a very sweet, dear, lovely man. And I miss him terribly. But he's best known because I'm sure at least some of you will have seen those famous pictures of naked witches on the shores of a lake. Probably wasn't Loch Ness, it was probably Lake in Ireland, but that doesn't matter. With a bloke wearing a tall hat, brandishing a sword or a magic wand, marching up and down. Well, the bloke with the tall hat, Tony Shields, and at least one of the naked witches made me dinner a couple of times. That was sweetie pie. This tells the story, again, 1977, a year when all sorts of tremendous weird stuff happened. And it was a year in which Tony Shields claims that he saw and photographed the Loch Ness Monster. His images that he produced are fairly controversial. Some people have referred to it as the Loch Ness Muppet. All I will say is I never caught Tony out lying to me, so as I know, he never lied to me. He would obfuscate. He would not answer questions. He'd hide behind the truth, but he never lied. And right until the last time I met him, he swore blind that he'd seen the Loch Ness Monster that day, and that the photograph of the head and neck coming out of the water was a true depiction of what he saw. It is the story of how he took these photographs. It is the story of what happened over Easter that year when there were sightings of a monster known in the Old Cornish language as Morgar along the coast of southern Cornwall, and how the woods near Falmouth, in Falmouth Bay, particularly those next to Morn Old Church, were haunted by the grotesque Owlman that I mentioned earlier and that Richard mentioned earlier. I think it's a wonderful book. We published an edition of it, but to be quite honest, for all sorts of reasons, so I won't bore you with, I prefer the original edition, which Bob Rickard and Fortean Tomes put out in about 1991, I think, 1991, 1992. It is an absolutely smashing book. If you can work your way through it, it will tell you an awful lot. If you get bogged down in it, it will tell you nothing, which means it's a pretty bloody good primer for Fortean zoology, because that is what the whole world of Fortean zoology is. It'll tell you everything, it'll tell you nothing. It'll lead you round in circles, it will bamboozle you, and it will make you go off to bed and drink large amounts of Guinness. I can't recommend this book further highly enough.
If you want to support us and help us make more content like these, please press like, subscribe, follow our Facebook page and check out our Patreon.
And as the ghost of Joe Strummer, who's an ever more regular visitor to my little studio, says,
don't forget to ring the notification bell, otherwise you'll miss the new episodes.
And that would be an awful pity, wouldn't it?
If you've been affected by any of the topics in today's episode, you can just bugger off, because we don't give a monkeys. Bloody well get a grip. Sort your own bloody problems out rather than ringing up somewhere.
That was a public information film.
And that is about it for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed doing this section with Richard, and I'm looking forward to next week when we have the second part of the two of ours top 5 Fortean books. I want to say a big thank you to Richard and to my producer Louis, who is currently gallivanting around the southern states of America on a white horse and wearing a big hat and pretending to be John Wayne. I want to say a big thank you to Graham, my deputy, and the not only Deputy Director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, but he's also my carer, which means he's the guy who takes me to the hospital twice a week, if not more at the moment. And he's the guy who looks after me, puts me to bed, gets me up again, and helps me when I fall over, which again is something I do more often than I would like to admit. And I want to say a big thank you to Gwyn, who's doing a fantastic job as Assistant Director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and who, I sincerely hope, is, together with Louis, going to take over the job of ringmaster of this particular circus when I finally keel over, retire, or drop down dead, whatever happens. Now we've got something very exciting just about to start. I'm not sure how this episode's going to tie in with this because I'm not sure of the date that's going to be coming out as I speak to you. But on the last Wednesday of every month, the CFZ are going to be taking over Spooky Viv's show on the Simply Spooky network, and we are going to be doing something that Dave Scott suggested that we do a long time back, and we just haven't got around to it. Well, now we have got around to it. There is going to be a open forum, a round table, if you like, where two regular guests, who will be Dave Scott and Ian Squibbs, plus special guests each episode. I always get issues and episodes mixed up, probably because I've been an editor in the spoken word for the written word longer than I've been an editor for the spoken word. We're going to have special guests each month. The moment for the one at the last Wednesday in April, it's going to be Harlan Karma, and it's going to be V. McCrinnan. I always said the CFZ are the last gang in town, and this is going to be the last gang show, and it's going to be presented by me and the lovely Spooky Viv, who is a lady of whom I am extremely fond. And she and I have proved over various episodes of her show, which I have recently started co-hosting, while the regular co-host is off sick, and we work very well together. We enjoy being silly together, and I think if anybody's going to keep the last gang in town under control for an hour or an hour and a half once a month, it's going to be Spooky Viv. That's Vivian Powell for you. I will be posting links to the show when I have them. So I'm going to be back next week. I've already told you, next week we're going to have part 2 of Richard's and my top 5 books, which will have both surprises and ones that seem perfectly logical. I'm back on Wednesday. What am I doing on Wednesday? I can't actually remember what I'm doing Wednesday. Let's hold on. Let's talk amongst ourselves while I try and work this out. See, I do have. You may just think I just make it all up as we go along, but I do have the YouTube. What's it called? The YouTube. I can't for the life of me. It's the YouTube Studio. I have the YouTube Studio app on my iPad, and so most of the time I know what I'm doing. On Wednesday, what are we going to have on Wednesday? After all of that, I don't know. But we will have them, and there will be something. Oh, yes, I do know. It's going to be Southern Lake Monsters with Richard Freeman. We talk about lake monsters of the Southern Hemisphere. So I'm going to be there next Saturday doing all the gubbins I normally do on a Saturday. And if you're there, Mr. McCrinnan, I will almost certainly be seeing you. Bingo.